Hi, APUSH. Apparently, the world is ending because of the coronavirus pandemic, and so it's a perfect day to talk about the Cold War arms race and nuclear disaster. This is an extension of the last lecture, the long one that I had to break into two parts, where we just kind of introduced the Cold War. Remember, the Cold War is just a 46-year rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, and they're competing over literally everything that they possibly can. So they're competing over who gets to the moon fast enough. They're competing to discover which is better, communism versus capitalism. They're throwing money all over the world. They're getting in all of these different wars. But another extension of their rivalry is the arms race. And this is kind of like the scarier part of their rivalry in a lot of ways. And it comes to plague society for decades in the United States. And it causes a lot of Americans to act very bizarre, which I think has some implications for today. And so we're going to look at the arms race specifically, kind of what starts it, how do Americans respond to it, and what is the legacy of it that we see today. So first, just by definition, an arms race, it's referring to weapons. So arms is just another way of saying weapons. And so during the 1950s, what we see the United States and the USSR starting to do is compete for over two things. One, how many weapons do they have? So it's the accumulation of as many weapons as they can get as possible, but also two, the superiority of those weapons. So not only how many they have, but who has more powerful weapons. And they start this rivalry in the 50s, the arms race starts in the 50s, but it continues on throughout the 1980s, the entire Cold War. Sometimes it will kind of like go dormant, and we'll have periods where they say, okay, we're going to try to like restrict how many weapons we're going to use, but other times it flares up again. So we see this kind of happening throughout the entire period of the Cold War, which is why we want to talk about it in its own lecture. But first we have to go back to understand, how is it that the Soviet Union even gets a bomb in the first place? Like, what starts this rivalry? Because after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the United States, they're feeling good. Like, we have this new technology. We're the only ones in the world who have this technology. So how do we go from them believing they're the only ones who have access to nuclear weapons, to all of a sudden being involved in this arms race? And the answer to that is basically, again, back to the Manhattan Project, back to World War II. Remember that video that I showed you on the atomic bomb? And I think it alluded to this part where basically we ask Britain, our BFFs, hey, we're building, these bombs. We need some scientists. Can we borrow some scientists? And the British say, sure, of course you can borrow some scientists. And we say, hey, have you vetted these people? Like, do you trust these people? Are their background checks clean, good? You're sending us good people? They're like, yeah, don't worry about it. Oops. They end up sending over a couple of Soviet spies. And so even though these British scientists are working in the Manhattan Project to build an American atomic bomb, they're sending all that information back to the Soviets, which is why when Truman at the Potsdam Conference tells Stalin, hey, we have this new bomb, literally Stalin is just like poker face. Like, he doesn't move his face, and Truman's like, this is weird. Why isn't he reacting? It's because he already knows, and he already has one in the works too. So that kind of backfires. But we don't realize they have one until years later. It's not until September of 1949 that you have some American planes that are kind of cruising over Siberia, just kind of checking things out over in the northeasternmost portion of the Soviet Union. And they see this cloud. And we all know what the mushroom cloud is, right? So they see this cloud and they go, that's a radiation cloud. They have a bomb. And this is when the United States realizes, again, that their arch enemy, the Soviet Union, has an atomic bomb. And so there's that threat and that paranoia that starts the arms race, right? And it's driven by this fear. If they have one, we need to have more, and we need to have stronger weapons. So President Truman goes to his people, his scientists, and he charges them with creating something new, okay? And he creates the Atomic Energy Commission in order to figure this out for him, figure out a new bomb. And what they come up with is something called the hydrogen bomb. Now, this is when it gets scary. Because remember all those pictures I showed you of the atomic bomb and the damage that could be done in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? I mean, just in Hiroshima, Within 2 minutes, you have over 60,000 people that go missing or declared dead. You have people who literally vaporize and their shadows are casted onto concrete structures next to them. That's just from the most primitive new form of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki. So imagine after some time and further science and progress, what they're able to come up with. Now, these are just predictions because obviously we've never dropped a hydrogen bomb in its fullest sense. We have tested them in the 1950s. 1952 is the first test of the hydrogen bomb where they figure out we have one, it actually works, but we've never actually dropped one of these. So these are just estimates, but they're still scary nonetheless, okay? Now, it's estimated that a hydrogen bomb is 1,000 times stronger than an atomic bomb, okay? 1,000 times stronger. That means, just for some equivalence, the bombs that we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those two bombs, in and of themselves, each of them, they produce the equivalent of about 12,000 tons of TNT, okay? So what we dropped in Hiroshima is about 12,000 tons of TNT. The hydrogen bomb that we tested in 1952, it's predicted to be the equivalent of 10 million tons of TNT, okay? So 12,000 tons of TNT on Hiroshima versus 10 million tons of TNT in a hydrogen bomb. That's big, okay? And so obviously we never dropped one of these, but in the 1950s, this is what they are announcing to the world that they now have access to, what they've created. This is what actually starts the arms race, because once we announce that we have that, what is the Soviet Union going to do? Remember, Cold War is a rivalry. They now have to have one. So they start building hydrogen bombs. We start building more of them. And it's this that sets off technically the arms race that we see, again, starting in the 50s and lasting throughout the 1980s. Now, you can imagine that this causes a lot of panic in America, right? Because these are really big bombs. And if they can do so much more damage than what we saw happening over in Japan, it causes a lot of panic within people just living in the United States and people living in the Soviet Union, to be honest. Everybody's just kind of panicked. And as we've seen, panic, mass hysteria, it causes people to do really silly and kind of illogical things, like buying every roll of toilet paper that they can find in a 10-mile radius, around their house. So we are still seeing the effects of kind of mass hysteria and paranoia in humanity, even today. This is not something new. This happens, and so the government obviously wants to calm people down, right? We want to make sure that people feel safe, even though we're making all of these really crazy, powerful bombs. And so one of the ways that they do that is by producing, and if we were together, I would show you these. They're just so incredible. These like government PSAs, these public service announcements, where they're very in a very calming voice, like a Morgan Freeman voice, basically like, don't worry, America, we have this under control. All you have to do is build a bomb shelter. And if you're in the PowerPoint for this lecture, and if you start scrolling through, you'll see a slide with a bunch of pictures on it. Americans literally are building bunkers and bomb shelters in their backyards in the 1950s and 60s that they are convinced is going to save them from a nuclear attack. Now, if there is a nuclear attack, they're going to have to be in it for a long time. So the government also advises them to keep 3 to 6 months worth of supplies in their bomb shelter. So you have these women, and the pictures show it, who are canning all of this stuff and preserving all this food and sticking it in their bunker. They say your kids are going to be in there, so make sure they have coloring books and board games and things to do for the 3 to 6 months that they're going to be stuck in their backyard in this bunker. It seems illogical, and now you're probably laughing right now. I mean, it's laughable to me. But Americans are convinced that this is what's going to save them. On top of that, you have American children who are going to school, right? And so as a parent, you might be nervous to send your kid to school knowing that a nuclear attack could come at any time. And so the government says, don't worry, we're taking care of them too. In fact, I thought, since we're in a time of panic, that I would have my children demonstrate what it is that the government said to do in times of panic. So, Izzy, Noah, come here. The government during this time, again, is telling American children, don't worry, you're safe at school. All you have to do is this. Can you guys show me what you do during a nuclear disaster? Show me what you do during a nuclear disaster. You see how they're covering the backs of their necks? Oh, I'm so proud of them. They'll be so safe in a nuclear disaster. That's what the government told kids to do. That's going to save American children. Now, again, you probably looked at that and think, okay, how did they know to do that? That looks like an earthquake drill. And you'd be right. That's basically what we do in an earthquake drill. But in the 60s and 70s, that's what American children practice in order to save them from a nuclear attack. Now, again, laughable. You're probably sitting there just like scratching your head like, oh, these silly Americans. Why are they doing it? It's because they're trying everything they can to convince Americans, don't worry, we got it. We got a plan. Whether your kids are at home in their bunker or here at school, they're going to be safe. You're going to be safe. It's business as usual here. Okay. But they're also giving arguments, like broader arguments, strategical arguments about why Americans are safe, not just telling them to build bunkers or get under their desks or get under a table. There's actually two different arguments for why an arms race in the long run produces peace, and we can still see these arguments today, okay? The first one is called mutually assured destruction, okay? And basically in the 50s and the 60s, you have the government saying, don't worry, we're never actually going to use these things because we know if we did, we would mutually assure our destruction. Now, what does that mean? If we have an atomic bomb or a hydrogen bomb and we drop it, right? What is the Cold War, in the Cold War sense, what is the Soviet Union going to do? Well, they're going to drop one, and then we're going to drop two, and then they're going to drop two, and then we're going to drop three, and we're going to go back and forth until we what? Mutually assure our destruction, right? And nobody wants that, right? The point of the rivalry is not to destroy the entire world. And so the argument becomes, by having all of these really big bombs, and a lot of them, we're actually preventing ourselves from using them and therefore producing world peace. Now that seems ridiculous, but that's the argument that, again, the government is putting out to people. We have all this stuff, but don't worry, we're not going to use it because we know if we do, it's going to set off the arms race, a nuclear war, and we will mutually assure our destruction. So you're actually safer in the long run because of this. Okay, so that's the first argument. The second argument that they give is something called Brinksmanship, and we still see this in our society all the time. Brinksmanship is when you make a lot of threats, a lot of really intense and kind of exaggerated, bombastic threats, until it brings you to literally the brink of war. That's where we get that word Brinksmanship. And so the goal is to take you to the brink of war, and through your threats, convince the other side that you just might be crazy enough to actually act on them. So it would sound something like this, and tell me if you've heard this before. It would be like, I'm going to bomb you. I don't like what you did, so I'm going to bomb you. Okay. And then the next one would be, I'm not just going to bomb you, I'm going to use a nuclear bomb. And then the next one would be, I'm going to use 2 nuclear bombs, and I'm going to do it on these 2 cities. And then the last threat would be, my finger is on the button, like the code's in, my finger's on the button, I'm about to press it. Okay. So the threats are amplifying, intensifying over time, taking you closer to the brink of war. Now, what's the point of that, right? You're trying to convince your enemy, the other side, the person you're making these threats to, that you just might be crazy enough to actually press the button, okay? And the frequency and intensity of the threats is what convinces them, oh my gosh, they might be that crazy, I better back down, okay? Now, this is super risky. It's not a good strategy to employ, in my opinion, but we do see the government still using it. If you remember about a year ago, what I'm hoping that you're recalling or thinking of, remember when we kind of had that spat with North Korea and we were saying, oh, like, I'm going to bomb you, and they were telling us that they were going to blow Guam off the face of the earth, and it went back and forth. That was Brinksmanship. And in that case, it did kind of actually work. Remember the media, even just, day to day in talk, we would talk about, man, President Trump and these announcements that he's making, this is crazy, right? That was the whole point. That was Brinksmanship, taking you to the brink of war, convincing the other side, he just might be crazy enough to do it. In fact, even Americans thought that. And what happened? North Korea eventually did back down from all of those threats. And so we still see this strategy employed today. Again, it's risky, probably not the best strategy to use, but it is a pretty common military strategy when you're having these conflicts with other countries. The other slide in my PowerPoint, aside from the pictures that I had you look at earlier, are a couple of graphics. And so the graphic on the top is a depiction. It's a line graph of how many nuclear warheads are created throughout the entire Cold War. So you can see that upward trend until you get to about the 1980s, 1990s. And that's when the Cold War ends and we sign a lot of disarmament agreements where we basically say, we're going to destroy these things. Like, this isn't safe. We're going to try to destroy these things in an effort to gain gain trust in each other and ease suspicion. And so that's where you start to see the downward trends around the 80s and the early 90s. So the graphic on the bottom underneath that one, that is technically, according to 2017 information, how many nuclear warheads are in existence today and how many each country says that they have. So we kind of do a survey every once in a while where, like, raise your hand if you have a nuclear warhead and how many do you have. Now, this is international information, but there's also a lot of reasons that you may want to lie about this. And so even though these are the stated numbers, we can't rely a ton on that information. So the United States, for instance, says, oh, we only have 6,500. I guarantee we have way more than that. We just don't want to tell anybody. North Korea, on the other hand, they say they have 15, probably a little bit of an exaggeration, by probably about 15. And so even though these are the stated numbers, you can't really trust them, but the point is that we are making an effort to be more transparent now in how many we have, because we realize how dangerous they can be and what can come of them. So questions, let me know. Wash your hands.